Dr. Altman with the allergy
stuff,
section.
probably.
So,
we'll see.
You know, is it, what is the most word?
How are you?
okay, so can you, remember in New England we had this struggle, and either you or Renee was in our consensus.
Yeah, I'm not a member of that, plus I don't have it.
I'm willing to do that again.
How are you?
Just kidding.
Good.
Well, I think it's something, I just want to see, you know, like 50 diseases have been such traumatic disease.
Okay.
Not even,
There's going to be multiple sections on it, what specifically you want.
All right, so you'll be here before I leave the building. Okay.
I'll take
I brought my coffee cup.
There you go. That's good.
Hi there. How are you?
Hey, Gary.
Yes.
You know that cruise that you're really interested in?
Yeah, it's a year from
It's
now.
a year from now. So we have
You got a couple of days.
a couple of days.
Couple of days.
I think we may do it with Can you send me the info again?
Yeah, well,
Okay. good.
Which one is this?
oh, the one in Coral City.
World War
City
II
and Great Barrier Reef.
and World War II.
Well, I would assume they did. We don't think it's over.
Well,
You know, vanished to New Caledonia. So no, you're in that area. I don't know.
Oh, the camera.
You know, they have education.
Yeah. That's that
You
one.
know, a lot of work. Every day you're in life. That's it. All right, just.
Yeah, it's on land.
Well,
It's above my pay
that's up
grade.
to you. You fly in a day or see that. Get back this day. You might want to stay. Yeah, well, I'll send you.
Somebody else did. So
Good morning, guys. Next guy, got my email. No. That's true. I forwarded it on. And then Stan Seitz, he gave me Stan's email.
Oh, good, thank you.
So I wrote to Stan.
Good. Thank you. Well, we can move.
Oh, what is it? Now, is this gonna be in your old place? Or
you're supposed to go last
You have to wait for the new stuff. After August.
Looks like right on the Alaska location. Yeah, I can pour my own stand up on I-5.
They're in it.
Unless he goes back road.
Yeah, they were both there. Well, just make sure. You know, I'm below in here. I was 22 minutes to get, I'm all. But there's no traffic. I can't lie. If I waited 10 minutes more, it would take me 45 minutes. You know, it's like double just for that little 10-minute window. I gotta leave my house at about 6:10.
No, this one doesn't.
It's fine. It's fine.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Baby's out.
All right.
How long you have to?
Well, the other room is on.
Yeah.
They said I could see it exactly. That's why I did. Well, the man knows, but they said.
Well, he said he could see me, and he could see this room. So we'll broadcast right.
Well, you don't find out for sure how well it works.
Yeah, it's got this thing in it. It fills up.
Well, no, so you do take it out and dress it. You
Yeah.
take this out.
Yes, it is. I do prefer to have to buy it.
Yeah, okay.
But this packing. And I think it's made of put the tongue together. Wow.
Oh, that's true. I actually figured that. You were getting a little vertigo with all this. I believe it. That's true.
The frailties of age.
Exactly. Might have surgery Thursday. I feel like even worse than I did yesterday.
I couldn't run for a month. That was all.
What was that?
Just tore, you know, the wear and tear. It's on the last row. I was rowing, and it popped.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I had to put the Perrigo all over it. So you do survive it. You don't think so. It is. It's not fun. It's the worst thing I ever had in my life. I can't complain.
Well, that's the thing. Everything I've done.
You know, he was one of the best kickers in the NFL for the season. Yeah, he's a good kicker. You know, did you see how the last two, when the balls first turn the lace on the way? Of that one before
The screen next door says record Richard.
Good work.
I'll call in a second.
Then I don't kick
Lace work. Great. I did.
but he's shaking so bad.
It was great. Although I'm over 10 years out.
Yeah, it's
a whole year.
It's like immunotherapy.
After a decade or so. So you need not have to wear glasses with lights. That was ridiculous.
Very dynamic. Yeah, so
But
I'm gonna email
I
you.
probably need glasses.
Well, I think
So it was like,
Especially the rain.
Yeah.
I've been doing it over 10 years after I had it.
oh,
It worked so well.
yeah, I was 2015 the next day.
Wow.
Back there, just Daniel.
Like, drawing in the dark, you look over your shoulder and see everything.
Alice with Adrian.
That was part of the reason, that's why I had both.
Good.
Good.
I usually get up.
The other room.
I can't believe it seems like they should have gotten all the cakes out. Those are still showing up here. Should be able to push on it.
What else do you do to get some?
All right, I'll go. Kids have another 23 hours of dark.
By the way, where's the food?
no, I would, and then we had a booth also.
Well, watch the
They were.
Yeah.
They died, were resurrected.
I think what happened if they had just pounded the ball.
Mix it up. What?
I threw that out right at the beginning.
But she didn't have that. I think they were thinking nobody's going to score, so maybe the only one cover and maybe that is, if there were, maybe some ran down, but that's the only thing. Because if they just ran, they couldn't just. But they forget.
It's amazing. Washington State is a small person.
Yeah.
Well, I think what they should have done more is that, pass option.
Yeah.
The side has the option. I think that would be a great option. And I think that could have worked very well, especially on a whole day. It's just hard to use like this direction.
Okay.
And they did have runs. And they couldn't get the poor woman. So anyhow, of course, then you know. Well, exactly. It was. That's what they should have done. But then they couldn't get that first down.
Bartenders had
Wonderful. That's going to go get some.
I can't serve you.
He just had enough on it.
I feel so sorry for the kids. I'm thankful for Seattle.
A little sorry.
Yeah, the laces toward them.
Yeah.
That's true.
Well,
Although
no,
he kicked
on
the
the replay,
previous
though,
his foot.
He was saying he was out the door on his way here.
They just Are you from this area?
They timed the
We got an allergy question.
Richard Sherman almost lost that one. He looked like he had a hair. But the guy, of course, made the field goal when the laces were toward him previous kick.
You got a couple of rounds,
Although that made psychological.
I think it was
No, you
above the shoulders.
way back.
Yeah.
Brian?
He's unwrapping. Fires just
Before you're done.
Oh, you know what?
Right, he did dermatology, yes, he did dermatology, yeah.
Okay.
You know who I mean?
We'll wait a couple of minutes because Drew's not certain of broadcasting correctly. Per usual. And normally I get you a cup of coffee. I don't know what breakfast is.
Kind of early.
Well, the construction guys are picking up the parts. I know, it was hard to get work today. And I get here like 15 minutes early. And today, it was pretty full.
Oh, I know.
It took me 4 minutes to drive here and about 6 minutes to park.
Yeah, that's happening, I think, as of today. You'll get a notification or two.
Yeah, looked at my emails last night.
Key thing is,
I better get open up the garage.
Yeah.
you know what I do with things like that, it's certain virus, middle of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've gone back.
Quite late. I should get the memo on that.
Great track, yeah.
Something like that.
Have you already read it? Yep, shots there. What we think drugs it is. It might work.
What are the odds that
It's a frustrating disease. This is all too well. Our neighbor had a name. I said, yo, I love that. Here, visually, it's out. I met my kids. The thing is, it's more, which is really exciting. Oh, okay. I think there's a lot of they have fellows and I don't think there's and I have to do that. Mainly because my dad's around. I don't know if you know this. I was around the university for 10 years. I get a few complications. I got about 20 complications. One was
Okay, let's go ahead and
I'm sorry about it. That helps a lot.
I'll be happy the day someone takes over this job. Between the technology and the food coming right now. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. From the outside audience, per usual, we have our technical problems. Drew tells me at the moment, you can probably see the room, maybe you can see me and the rest of us up here, but you don't see what you're supposed to see, the PowerPoint presentation. So for those listening on the outside, hopefully we'll switch that in the next, 10 or 15 minutes. You'll see the correct image on your home computer. Now you'll have to look at the PowerPoint that we sent out yesterday, but hopefully follow along with Steve's audio today. So the word of the day is OHSU. I don't think that's really a word, but that's where Steve used to be before he moved to Seattle. And for those not really in this area, there's been a tremendous amount of activity and change and research and clinical opportunities for patients with food allergy, and a lot of that has been spearheaded by Steve, who's worked immensely hard to create the Seattle Food Allergy Consortium and other associated study groups, and he's had a lot of co-workers here who I'm sure he'll acknowledge as well. So I asked him to basically review everything going on in the metropolitan Seattle area regarding food allergy, clinical research, and otherwise.
Sound good? All right, well, thanks, Len, for that introduction. And also, wanted to just, if you're wondering what's in my ear, I had a minor ear surgery last Wednesday, and I've been told that normally I talk really loudly, but I've been told I'm talking not as loudly because I can hear myself more loudly than I should. So let me know if I need to speak up. And I'm not yet dizzy, so if I start wavering and feel like I'm going to close, you'll know why. And I think Glenn sort of characterized that the history well. It was very flattering, but this was stuff that's gone on in food allergy the last 5 or 6 years has really been a collaborative effort with me, one of the people, and a bunch of other allergists. I think it's a great example of how this community cooperates together. On one hand, business-wise, theoretically, we're all competitors, at least the ones that aren't in the same group. But for something like this to get going, it really had to have honest trust and collaboration to make it work. So, and I think it's hopefully going in the right direction. So, comprehensive review kind of intimidated me, so I changed it to food allergy activities in Seattle as of 2016. These are my disclosures. I'm, as you know, probably a partner at Northwest Asthma and Allergy, but also an employee of Asthma Inc., a research center, and I get a salary from Asthma Inc., so I actually don't get money from these companies, unfortunately, at least not directly. And what I'm going to do today is go through a background first, and then get a little out of my area, the basic and translational research, which is a critical piece that is unique in our community and part of the foundation of our collaboration. And then review what I know best, which is the clinical research activities that are going on. And then finally, how that's impacted patient care, both in clinics and also in the lives of the patients that have been in studies that are off protocol, and now what do I do type of thing once they're eating the food. As you all know, food allergy was relatively rare as recently as 1995. I picked that time because that's when I finished my fellowship. And I was in practice initially at seafood allergy once or twice a week, probably, and now it's 6 or 7 times a day. So it may have been biased in my N of 1, but it definitely changed. And I'm arbitrarily choosing 2005 as sort of the turning point where the really good therapeutics that we've developed for asthma, which were not available 20 years ago, became available and were being implemented freely, and so the unmet need in asthma really shrunk significantly. I mean, meanwhile, the epidemiology of food allergy was changing at unprecedented levels. So I'm saying 2005. It was probably before that actually that it became apparent, but that's about when it dawned on me personally that Seattle had some opportunity and potential that was not being realized in this unmet need. And I'll say, we were compared to the big players, the Mount Sinai, the Johns Hopkins, Denver, Duke, and then more recently Stanford, we were doing nothing. And it seemed like you look at a map of the country, there was sort of this big area in the Northwest that was flanked. At least when it came to food allergy stuff going on. There's a unique aspect of food allergy compared to some of the other diseases that we treat and the treatments that get developed. And I'm sure that in the audience, there's a lot of people employed by the pharmaceutical industry. Does anybody's company have a food allergy product in development? Now, there's a reason for that. It's kind of hard to do this. And as we all know, the markers of allergy in food allergy are imperfect and don't correlate very well with clinical reactivity. So primary outcome to show an improvement is much more challenging to do than FEV1 or validated symptom score instrument, for example. So and it's a difficult animal. The combination of avoidance of the food and carrying self-injectable epinephrine has been a pretty successful treatment algorithm, at least for avoiding death. So we have to be very careful that anything we're doing isn't introducing risk that is more significant than that. And some of you are old enough to remember several years ago we had a pro-con debate where Jim Baker from Oregon, who's been doing oral immunotherapy out of his office for close to 10 years, wanted to share his data, and Kevin Dooms asked me to do the con to say it's not ready to be done. I mean, it's too dangerous. And after saying no twice, and after famous people said no, I finally agreed to do the con, and I pretty aggressively argued against doing oral immunotherapy in your offices. So if you think I'm a hypocrite, I mean, maybe I am, but we're trying to do it at least in a way to understand the safety better and through protocols, and then as we integrate it into our practice, have a little better track record. Let's just say a little word about primary prevention. We're not on the cutting edge of this, but it's basically worth mentioning, a LEAP study, and I feel that its uptake in terms of, primary physicians having patients streaming into our offices that with their 4 or 5 month olds with eczema to get skin tested. It's just not happening. I mean, it's happening a little, but this is going to take a while to catch on. There's a lot of probably new sensitizing of clinical peanut allergy that's happening despite this data being in the literature for a year or so. So I'm guessing it'll be a decade or two before that the undoing of that is reflected in the child population under age 10 having peanut allergy or not, and presumably that will extend to other foods too. So this probably will change significantly, but not at least till I retire. Anyway, so what about what's going on here locally? Well, in 2008, one of the wonderful things about electronic medical records is that you can very quickly quantify things by, for example, age, diagnosis code, and zip code, whatever. And so for clinical research, it's really good. And for like arguing that we should be included in in whatever study, it's pretty good because we have with asthma as a big group, so I can use 14 partners worth of data. And in 2008, we had 6,000 office visits that included a food allergy diagnosis, and that was actually 33% of all office visits included such a diagnosis, which is pretty striking compared to at least my experience earlier in my career, where it was much less common. Then in 4 short years, we had the same number of partners, so it wasn't like our group expanded at the speed of light. The total number of patient visits was very similar, but there's over 10,000 and 44%. So the proportion of visits that included a food allergy diagnosis was increasing as well. So yeah, it's imperfect. I mean, it could have been oral allergy syndrome or whatever, but it definitely is an example that the Northwest wasn't spared the epidemic by any means. Let's talk a little bit about the Seattle Food Allergy Consortium, because this was sort of the first thing that the idea came into existence 5 years ago or so. And this is a collaboration between the University of Washington, Benaroya Research Institute / Virginia Mason, Seattle Children's, and the Northwest Asthma and Allergy Center / Asthma Inc. And so even though there's other allergists that have been involved, those institutions have been the core of this consortium. And the vision is to combine research and education resources in the Seattle community to find a cure for food allergy. So basically, at least for me personally, I just wanted to be part of something that was helping in a really positive way. And it occurred to us that when you combine these institutions, all of a sudden it's a world-class place for food allergy. And without combining, it's not. I mean, in fact, there's a reason it wasn't on the map. And as I mentioned, these are the members. This is the executive committee, so Mary Farrington, Bill Henderson, Suzanne Scota-Smith, myself. And we we're doctors. We don't do this for a living, but we meet periodically and have had several fall symposia that are for the community, for educational purposes, and also to generate interest in the cause. But and we've got active fellow, sort of coordinated fellow involvement in Food Allergy World Challenge Clinic, which I'll summarize later as well. All right, so what about, everybody's heard of FAIR. And there's become a Seattle connection, at least in the past year, that is quite striking and not coincidence that it followed several years of the CFAC initiative. So first and most impressively, I think, is Investigator Food Allergy Award was recently given to Eric Wambre from BRI. And he's really focused on identifying sort of immunologic markers at the T cell level that correlate with real clinical reactivity versus non-activity. And I'll sort of go through slightly, or in a very superficial way, what he's up to. But it's a very prestigious award, and is appropriate. Bill Kwok, his colleague, as you all know, has been doing great work with simplifying sort of the isolation and characterization of allergen-specific T cells for years, and that's been a nice opportunity for our fellows to do their research as well. And then, sort of in the same year, in the last year, our clinic, Northwest Asthma and Allergy Center, was awarded this Clinical Network of Excellence, or Center of Excellence award from the FAIR, which includes some funding for a clinical coordinator and also principal investigator. And so the reason I think we were picked for this is more because we already have an infrastructure for clinical research and a big clinic. And so we would potentially lend itself to collaboration internally and a systems approach to both the research and clinical care in food allergy. And there's I don't know, 12 or 15 centers around the country, and it's increasing in size. So FAIR's been really supportive, and among other things, they'd like to have a registry created and collaboration through that means. Well, let's go a little bit out of my immediate zone, so I'll be sharing work of others, but as I mentioned, Eric, in more of a translational model, been doing antigen-specific assays, and peanut is sort of the hallmark, but they've done a lot of other food allergy work as well, which I'll sort of list for you later. But the basic idea now that immunotherapy in food has become legitimized. In fact, the FDA, which is interesting to me, is no longer requiring a placebo control before and after to get done with immunotherapy to food. So oral immunotherapy is just accepted to work. The placebo control comes after you've done that, in terms of like measuring tolerance or showing safety getting there. But so that's really nice when you're recruiting patients. So they're not being desensitized with placebo. They're all in these studies, at least with the oral immunotherapy, getting it. With the epicutaneous, as you'll see, there's a placebo arm. But most of these are pediatric studies, and thankfully the ethics sort of require that every patient get active treatment at some point. So there's typically an open label extension, which is nice. So, but figuring out the immune characteristics that correlate with clinical reactivity and markers that correlate with sustained unresponsiveness, or at least desensitization, is what Eric has been focusing on. And it's still up in the air. It's not a finished product by any means, but it's been fascinating, and it's a worldwide center at BRI for exciting stuff. I mean, several years ago, just sitting at plenary sessions at the Academy, listening to Wes Burks and others, they're all talking about Bill Kwok's stuff, that they sent and got, and Eric is right there with them. So, anyway, and the latest parlance here is figuring out, these are all T cells, allergen-specific, and this, we'll just say peanut allergen-specific T cells. The purple are the ones that are pathogenic or causing the clinical reaction to peanut in the patient. And the plump ones are the ones that are active. And you can see the markers, the ones that we've done for forever, IL-4, IL-13, IL-5, and the suppression of the sort of non-Th2 phenotype or the Treg phenotype. And then during immunotherapy, we now know there are actually specific activated T cell clone deletions. So they actually go away. They're not just, they don't just change what they do. They're gone, which is really exciting. And that I've only heard that being part of the conversation for a couple of years now. So it's still an unfinished story. And then this after immunotherapy, at least hopefully, and what they're finding with preliminary data is they're just none. I mean, especially if we see, skin tests turn negative sometimes, and this is pretty exciting stuff. Not something that we usually would expect with even inhalant allergen immunotherapy. We feel that generally it works fine when the skin tests remain positive, and we certainly don't even follow that usually. We just follow their clinical reaction. So it's a pretty exciting continuum, and this is sort of a basis for what he's applying his techniques for. And as you see, this is, and by the way, he gave me these slides on Friday while I was post-op from this surgery, so if I'm slaughtering them, I apologize. But anyway, he is actively involved in one of the studies that this big multi-center phase 3 oral immunotherapy trial from a company called Immune, which is a relatively modest goal oral immunotherapy that has a top dose of 300 milligrams, which is not that much, but it's certainly a lot when it comes to an individual patient and their fear of accidental exposure, for example. But anyway, he's been one of the lead science advisors for them, and he's done some preliminary work mechanistically and looking for markers. And what he does is both a basophil sensitivity assay, and he has this, I don't know if it's proprietary, but it's his thing, this Th2A cell, which many of you probably heard of, that is basically once somebody is no longer reactive, you can't, these cells are unmeasurable, essentially. And there's still a little, I think it remains to be seen where this shakes out, but he has this methodology, and it's been funded, and part of the things they want him to run with. On the other hand, over in the right-hand side of the slide, you see this method that Bill has been pioneering, and a lot of the fellows over the years have been involved with, which is this ability to separate and isolate allergen-specific T cells ex vivo and without harming them and changing them and changing their phenotype, being able to measure, both what they, if you want, say, ARA-H2 specific or whatever, have them and then see what their cell surface characteristics are, okay, and be able to see what the markers are in terms of their pathogenicity, we call it, for allergy versus tolerance. And they have these amazing techniques that are relatively recently developed that can help characterize these and follow them. So we're in the midst of sort of piggybacking several of the studies we're doing where patients will give blood before they undergo immunotherapy. So a separate consent form, and then the fresh blood goes to BRI. They run these studies and figure out, their T cell clones for the allergen in question, and then repeat the blood at the end of the study and looking for the phenotypes that correlate with tolerance. And Bill Kwok is told me several years ago he's absolutely convinced that this technique is going to be able to be something that's durable to follow. It'll be much more helpful than skin testing and immunocap testing at some point. Now, whether it's going to be practical to perform, who knows? Although in 1995, when I was a fellow, I was doing allergen-specific T cell cloning, and I tell you, this is a lot faster and a lot more. The idea that they can do all this stuff now is amazing to somebody like me that was the last time I was doing science. So if you project out another 10 years, this may be a lot simpler to perform as well. But anyway, BRI is doing great stuff. This is just a slide showing the difference in a sort of legitimizing the allergic versus non-allergic. That doesn't work, does it? I won't touch it anymore. And let's just focus on the right hand where you can see the. Is this pointer going to work? Yeah. So this is the peanut allergic and the non-allergic. You see the differences in the CCR4, and then the CD27, and then finally the CRTH2. And you can see that contrast. And then the next slide is looking actually at a very small number of patients from this oral immunotherapy early study. So this isn't allergic and non-allergic. This is same patients, or patients before and after immunotherapy versus placebo. And you can see these Th2A cells that Eric isolates are dramatically different. So a lot of this stuff is still in its infancy, but it's exciting work. They're also at BRI publications, which is this page. I just pulled from PubMed the recent ones that involve food allergy, and I'll illustrate these in a second. But keep in mind that this is just the food allergy stuff. They're also doing a lot of inhalant allergy work with Immune Tolerance Network, grass allergy, and others. So it's not limited to the food arena, and there's more and more parallels, as you probably all are well aware. Just like subcutaneous immunotherapy and sublingual immunotherapy have a lot in common. I think oral immunotherapy is just a little variation. So it makes sense they're involved in all of this stuff. And these publications, I won't really highlight their content other than their author list, because it does illustrate the collaboration that's going on. You see the constants are Eric Lombre and Bill Kwok, but there's also David Robinson, Mary Farrington, clinicians at Virginia Mason, and then fellows Dave Jiang, Sally Newbro, and who am I missing? Anybody else? No, there's other fellows that have had abstracts along the way as well.
Steve, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So go back to the slide where you show the apoptosis of the pathogenic T cells.
Let's see if I can pull that off here. How about the previous? There we go. One more.
Anyway, it just struck me that this one here, this would tell a picture that oral immunotherapy is very effective because you kill off the pathogenic T cells and they're gone. And yet clinically, at least what I know of the work that's come out of the East in particular, it's not clinically effective, that you temporarily desensitize people, but for the most part they're not tolerant in the long term. And so there seems to be a clinical mismatch between this cartoon and the clinical outcome so far with oral immunotherapy.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. So I mean, this cartoon is the sort of pie in the sky, result, but there definitely are patients that fit that. It's just not as comprehensive, and the data aren't as long term. I think once we get more, we'll talk about the MTAC study that uses omalizumab as a bridge, and so these patients are, at least 80% of them getting up to 2 grams of each food as their daily dose. We'll see. We just don't know yet how effective that is, and whether it's actually tolerance versus this desensitization, or sustained unresponsiveness versus desensitization. But this is the way it's going. But you're absolutely right. We're not there yet. So it's not prime time. We're going to cure everybody with food allergy by this method, and whether there'll be an adjuvant needed or what, we don't know.
It's also difficult to say that you actually get active deletion of specific T cells. So maybe there is some level of quiescence, and there's still, because I didn't read that paper, but I assume that what they're testing is the percentage of TCR-specific lymphocyte in peripheral blood, and you don't know what happens in the lymph nodes or in the gut lymph nodes, so they might still be there, just under control of some other
It's not
cells.
accessible in the periphery.
Yep.
Exactly. So remember, we were talking about one center, and as we all know, there are rivals elsewhere that are potentially critical as well. So I think we're not on the verge yet of a cure, but what we're hoping and what I think is accurate is they're looking for markers of clinical reactivity, and I think we'll see how that pans out. It's still kind of early though. All right, so moving on and sort of remember this is a survey or a sort of an overview rather than anything real detailed in one direction. So we've talked about the Seattle Food Allergy Consortium and about BRI's lab activity. It'd be really bad if we didn't include the connection with Stanford. So as many of you know, Carrie Nadeau from Stanford has become a big player in the food allergy world, and she was actually a little late to the table also. So she wasn't actually ever in the COFAR group that NIH sponsored powerhouse back east primarily, and she's kind of taken us under her wing, sort of the West Coast contingent. And part of that is not only done clinical studies, but there's been a fellow exchange. A couple of our fellows have actually gone down there for extended periods, including Dan and Lisa. And that, as you'll see, has blossomed into some other research collaboration. This clinical trial that I'll summarize in a little bit called MTAX is ongoing, and there's another one that is in the planning stages, and they're involving us in protocol design. And in fact, I have to say, the protocol's up to like Amendment 20 or something, and about 5 of those amendments were our input along the way after, because these, as you may know, investigator-initiated studies are flawed in terms of, that's not what we do. We're not professional protocol writers that are paid to do just that as our job. And so this is a sort of a living thing that we're and we've been really satisfied by that process, although it's been frustrating at times as well. And then there's also talk now with Kari has gotten together about 5 or 6 previous COFAR groups that are now sort of at our stage or a little beyond that are hoping to put together our own COFAR application when the RFA comes out soon. So that'd be exciting stuff, and so we've been really thankful and happy to be part of this collaboration. We've probably sent 6 or 7 people down to Stanford for at least a day or so, and including Mary Farrington came with Mary Lastly and myself and our coordinator. I've been back again, and so there's been this really active exchange, not just of fellows, but of physicians to try to learn from their setup, and they've been very generous with their sharing what they do. And so they're truly motivated by helping the patients, not just helping their own CVs. All right, so what about the twin studies? So Stanford has used this database in California of both monozygotic and dizygotic twins to look at epigenetic changes in asthma and other things, but they came up with at least some findings that seemed exciting related to passive smoke exposure that were different in different twins. And then fortuitously, while Dan was down there, you were down there for how long?
A month.
A month, yeah. And he's going to interrupt me and correct me when I get this, when I hatchet all this. But and it occurred to him, well, what about twins with food allergy? And so they looked and decided, well, let's first of all, Kari approached me before he went down there about actually expanding their database to include, it's not the University of Washington database, it's actually the state of Washington twin registry that they're going to tap, and to try to expand their findings. And then when Dan was down there, he thought, well, what about food? And so he's now in the middle of, and Kari said, this is fantastic, let's just do this. And this has been coined by Dan, the Gemini Project, and it's sort of this active collaboration that he's spearheading. And in fact, right now, there's a full-time coordinator from Stanford living in Seattle for several months and occupying a room at NAC, bringing in twins and getting, these are asthma twins, but also they're looking for food allergy twins to get data on them. And Dan's, he can in a minute he can share his initial findings and goals. But from my sort of clinician perspective, it's basically let's go fishing. So they're basically taking these, because as you know, these twins are this amazing sort of experiment that you can see twins reared in the same environment, not the same environment, and dizygotic versus monozygotic, and they're doing this basically genome sequencing, this methyl-seq-R, which I didn't even know existed, where you can just go looking for methylation, and a variety of other hits that they're looking for to try to characterize things better. So in 1 or 2 minutes, do you have anything to add?
So these are all, all these people had, all these twin pairs claimed food allergy, and so I brought them in and challenged them. And so the people that are included in this cohort are true food allergic people. So they're all challenge confirmed. And I now have a set of concordant monozygotic and dizygotic, as well as discordant monozygotics and dizygotic. So I have all 4 types now.
And the discordant monozygotic is
it's a triplet.
fascinating.
It's a triplet set.
Yeah.
So it's 2
so that's
monos.
the Apollo rather than the
Yeah,
Gemini.
exactly. So 2 monos and a di, and the di doesn't have food allergies. One of the monos does, but the other her identical twin does not. So it's an interesting set that we have.
Yeah, and so the collaboration is it's being done in Seattle with Dan's Allergy, and Stanford with NIH is doing the actual assays and whatnot. So it's been really good. And Kari, emails, how's it going? Because she knows that there are guys down here, and so it's been really fun. And they're paying for the space in our clinic and stuff. So it's a nice collaboration and a good example of how the fellow experience could be enhanced by this collaboration. Anyway, more to follow on that, I'm quite sure. Let's go now to clinical research in the remaining time, and then a little bit of patient care at the end. And this is sort of a general. Remember, I mentioned in the beginning, avoidance and asthma action plan. This is actually keeping people alive quite well, even though you hear about almost every death from food allergy. They're extremely rare. I mean, I think the data that I came up with for this pro-con debate was that a car accident was 4 times more likely to kill you if you have peanut allergy than an accidental peanut ingestion. And then since then, the Scandinavian paper proved me wrong. They actually had people that knew what they were doing and did sort of epidemiologic analysis. And it's at least 10 times more likely to die in a car accident than it is to die from peanut allergy. So I was wrong. It was even more different than that. So we have to keep this in mind. We don't want to hurt anybody in these studies because they're generally not being hurt, at least at that level. But as we all know, the morbidity is tremendous, and the fear, and it's not just the patient, it's their families, and it affects marriages, the whole deal. I mean, school, self-image. So there's a lot going on, and so there clearly is an unmet need that needs to be done. But from my point of view, and I think that most of us, that needs to be done right in a sort of well-thought-out way that protects the patients, and especially from the physician or investigator, I think it's sort of inherent coercion that can happen. I mean, it's a pretty big, ego boost as a doctor to have a patient look at you and say, "Oh my God, you're so wonderful. You were able to do this." And it's like part of why we went into this. But that's intoxicating, and it can really introduce, I think, bias into what we're doing. We have to make sure there's safeguards to protect the patients. Must being overly enthusiastic and introducing risks unintentionally. Anyway, so over the years, there was subcutaneous immunotherapy applied to peanut allergy, which I think most of you know failed. And that actually was my initial introduction to this whole field was after there was an unfortunate death in Denver. It was not due to the failed immunotherapy. It was due to an error with administering a maintenance dose subcutaneously to a patient who had been treated only with placebo, so it was a system issue. Anyway, that study was restarted after some safety changes, and part of the restart was to have an MD at the bedside during all the challenges, and I happened to be a fellow, and so I was able to sit, have protected time to sit at the bedside with all these food challenges, which was great. But it didn't pan out as a practical tool. It's certainly not nearly as effective as it is for inhalant allergens. And then there were the anti-IgE, sort of monoclonal antibody therapy alone as an intervention. And the Tanox 901 study, which some of you remember, that had a New England Journal publication in the early 2000s. Asthma Inc. was involved with that and recruited several patients. And that looked really good, but then there was this political fallout between the lawyers of Tanox, Novartis, and Genentech, and that was, I don't know, none of us know the truth, but it was basically ended that development, even though they had a phase 3 investigator meeting, and I had a plane ticket to Houston to go to that investigator meeting in 2003, and that just sort of fizzled because of that legal thing. So anyway, that was the anti-IgE injections, and then we'll talk a little bit more about rekindling of that. And then the oral sublingual immunotherapy, which has been in the literature for a long time, but very small numbers of patients and very select centers in the country. And then more recently, in the last 3 or 4 years, the epicutaneous patch studies, which we'll talk about, and then now more creative oral immunotherapy plus the biologic, in this case, monoclonal anti-IgE. So a lot of food allergy treatments out there right now. Let's keep in mind the difference between desensitization and sustained unresponsiveness, which is now become the preferred term over tolerance. It's as close to a cure as we're going to have, but as Len pointed out, we're not there yet. And also a reminder that I think I mentioned, since we've got a lot of people from the pharmaceutical industry here, and none of them has an employer who's pursuing a food allergy treatment at this point, and it's because of the logistics, I think, primarily, and the type of intervention that we feel is required here. But still, whatever is approved has to go through these phases. And as you'll see, there's 2 products already in phase 3 and another in phase 2, which is, couldn't say 5 years ago. Now, as I mentioned, Asthma Inc. as recently as as far back as 2002 was involved in that Tanox 901. And then Genentech came up with an analogous but much more ambitious protocol with, I think, a different clone of hydrodomide monoclonal anti-IgE, although I still have this suspicion that there may have been some, that they may have been the same thing. But anyway, that study we never started that study for contracting reasons, and that study was started elsewhere and then stopped because there was some safety issues that had come up part way. So that was a fizzle out as in 2005. And then Novartis, that had a higher affinity monoclonal anti-IgE, had come to the table, and Mary Farrington and I had almost, we were going to have it all up and running at BRI for CRC. I went to the investigator meeting, we were all set to go, and then Novartis pulled the plug on that one at the 11th hour. So you can see this is a labor of love. These things aren't falling in our lap. And then that was apparently restarted with the COFAR group, although I haven't seen any data from it. But let's talk about now the studies that have panned out and are ongoing. Starting with the DBV Technologies, it's a very small company in France that has non-allergists as their founders that have this technology of this epicutaneous protein delivery system. That the idea is that the intact 3-dimensional protein is absorbed through a patch, like an estrogen patch, 100% each day, but 0 intact protein gets into the bloodstream. So the idea was this was much safer, and yet 100% of it is getting in. And so that every day you change the patch, and these studies, and they had some good data ongoing. The VIPES phase 2 study began in 2013, and has a 2-year open label extension that goes through August. And I'll go through the protocol a little bit in a second. PEPITES, which you'll see the acronym later, but I can't But it's basically the same thing, but phase 3, which is starting in the next couple of weeks. And because there was a signal in the phase 2, at least in the kids under age 11, or I'm sorry, under age 12, and we'll look a little bit more about that. And then the other product that's getting further along is the Miles, the milk phase 2 patch, which just got initiated last month, and we have 3 or 4 patients in it already, and they're sort of lining up to begin. And so they've got one in phase 3, one in phase 2. There's other egg and others that are in development too. So this product has gotten going. The company went public less than a year ago. They were had a big splash at the Academy in March. So they came from nobody hearing about them to a big player very quickly. I don't know if any of you were at the evening talk by Donald Leung 3 or 4 years ago. I think he gave the Tuesday morning the next day. And we were already involved with at least the beginning of these. And I raised my hand and said, what do you think about epicutaneous delivery for immunotherapy? And he's like a world authority on atopic dermatitis and T cells on the skin and whatnot. And he said, no, it's not going to work. The skin is a sensitizing organ. And so, and he may still be right in terms of the practicality, but I was sort of, I took the wind out of my sails at the time. So it's an exciting technology, but it's still, it hasn't gotten approved yet, and we still don't know what the level of protection is going to be. We'll come back to that. But let's talk about the VIPES. It was double-blind, placebo-controlled, age 6 to 55, where they were given this patch for 12 months. We have only had the energy to get up and running at the Children's CRC for our oral challenges, so we only could do up to, they'll occasionally do a 22 or 23-year-old at the CRC, but we haven't gone older than that. And that's one of our goals in the next year is to get an adult challenge center up and running. And they, as all phase 2 studies, there's a dose ranging of 50, 100, and 250 micrograms versus placebo. To qualify, and these are important things, to qualify they had to have an objective reaction to less than or equal to, that's just greater than, less than or equal to 300 milligrams of peanut. And this was a tough one. We had some, and their bar is higher than some of the other studies, so there were some reactions. It was a good thing we were in the CRC. And in addition, you needed a peanut skin test of at least 8 millimeters and Immunocap of 0.7. Primary endpoint was actually a 10-fold increase in the threshold defined by the oral challenge, and that's why they were so strict about that. Some of the other studies have different primary endpoints, and they met that primary endpoint with the age 6 to 11 group, as I mentioned, and it was the largest trial ever for food allergy. So the COFAR trials are typically, 10, 20 patients. This was, 212 patients, so really big. And unfortunately, it didn't meet its primary endpoint in the older groups. And it only met the primary endpoint at the high dose. So there's still some question whether that's not the right dose. But with the PEPITES, which is the one that's just about to be initiated, they're doing it with a 250 microgram patch, as you can imagine. And that there's a 2-to-1 placebo, active to placebo, with a 2-year open label follow-up built in. And their goal is 265, so even larger trial this time around. And they have a couple ways of defining it as a response, and it depends on whether their initial provocation was to less than 10 milligrams or greater than 10 milligrams, but it has to be less than 300 in the end. So that we'll see how that goes. They have to have had a history of clinical reaction. Again, the 0.7 Immunocap is slightly different skin test wheel requirements for the phase 3, where at the younger age groups, greater than or equal to 6 millimeters, and the others stay with the same as the phase 2, which is 8 millimeter wheel. And then this positive oral food challenge. So, and we've got, 100 people that want to do this, so we're going to have to figure out a way to do that fairly. And we have a database at CFAC that has recorded the date of people signing up, showing their interest. But many of them, that was 2 years ago, and they are in, in other, they're over the 11 years old now, or they're doesn't work for their schedule. So we go quickly to who can come and get into the trial. So the other one that's ongoing, Miles, phase 2 milk epicutaneous immunotherapy. As you probably know, the animal is different with milk. I mean, it's much harder to keep milk out of your diet. So these patients are like uniquely motivated to be in the study, and so this may only be recruiting for 2 months or something before it fills up. But anyway, it's they're going for 176 subjects, and they've gone with 3 doses. Notice that they're higher now, so 150, 300, 500. So they're trying to define that if milk is different than peanut there, and the same kind of criteria for the double-blind challenge. They're going down to a floor much younger, which is a little nerve-wracking because they still need an oral challenge with objective symptoms. So H2 will do with caution, as you can imagine, but only targeting age 17. So this is also leaving adults out, based in part by the VIPES peanut results. Skin test wheel 6, immunocap with milk, they want at least 10, so we're looking to make sure that all the patients have that. It's 1 year plus a year of open label following that. And these doses, as I mentioned. And their primary outcome is, after 12 months, a 10-fold increase, which is similar to the VIPES, or 45 mils of milk, which would be great, because that's a fair amount. And if they have ever tolerated baked foods containing milk, they can't do that anymore because that is immunotherapy, and they can't be taking any milk. So some of them just opt out because of that. And we're currently recruiting, although they have a shortage of the study challenge material, so it's on hold for another 3 weeks or so. And then finally, the Immune phase 3 oral immunotherapy. Remember, this is the company that makes the oral peanut immunotherapy packaging, sort of like a Z-Pack or something, but it's for peanut. And so it comes with, it's basically like a kit. And Eric Wambre had done some of the science on the T-cell work from one of their earlier studies. They call this the Palisade Study. The endpoint is only 300 milligrams, and it's age 4 to 55. They do have to have a history of peanut reactions. But look at the criteria for the specific IgE. It's a 3 millimeter wheel, immunocap, basically something. So much different than, and in fact, their criteria for judging an oral challenge is much looser. And there's these Bach criteria for judging these things, and if you get really strict about certain number of points on the Bach scale, I mean, there are some people that are going to have protracted reactions if they want to keep going and qualify that end up sticking around for hours and need more than one dose of epi sometimes. So this is a much safer. You kind of think of this as the kindler, gentler approach. This is one that's sort of going to be more ready for prime time probably because it's only going to 300 micrograms or milligrams, and it's also very slow. 42 will build up initially. I'll show you the scale in a second. 3-to-1 active to placebo, and then of course an open label extension. And they want to just basically see that they tolerate. They get up to 300 milligrams safely is their main outcome, and we have the initiation visit tomorrow for this study. I want you to look at see if I can do this without messing up the slides here. But so there's a very modest initial rush desensitization. We don't want to call that a rush desensitization. It's almost below the threshold that anybody would react. But that's some of the sites that are doing this, by the way, are not doing it in a hospital setting. They're doing it in a clinic setting, which makes me nervous. So we're going to do it the way we always do it. And then they go up initially in these lower doses that are not expected to be as problematic, doubling doses. But then when it gets more up into the real range, it's only going up by 25%, which is, very modest. Remember, they're taking it every day, and then 2 weeks later, you go up by 25%, and then take it every day for 2 weeks. And so it's sort of, kind of what we're used to with immunotherapy, in subcutaneous immunotherapy, and we know the immune system can handle that typically, and that's why this is you can sort of envision this being, if it gets FDA approved, something where people are going to do okay. Anyway, and then there's a maintenance phase, and then follow-up challenges at the end. But remember that their endpoint is not tenfold increase or anything. So they have a looser definition of a positive on the bottom end and a looser definition of a positive at the top. But if they're eating, 500 milligrams and they were not able to before, I mean that's the idea, I guess. So anyway, well, let's change to the other one that's as I mentioned was in the last study, which is the multiple oral immunotherapy, multiple food oral immunotherapy plus omalizumab. So this is like the mother of all, change from allergic to tons of things to eating all those things in high quantities, and sort of like a very humbling prospect. In many ways, it's the only study I've ever been involved with that's been multi-center, investigator-initiated, and not sponsored by a company. It's sponsored by a foundation together with the university. So, and this foundation happens to be in Seattle. Sort of, we'd rather that in the future some of these get funded here rather than down in Stanford. But anyway, it's a very interesting study. Unique design, uses omalizumab as a bridge for 4 months, and there's a phase 2 or initial study that was published about a year ago that was collaborating with Boston that it seemed to be safer. And Stanford's up to about 150 patients that have been on this, so we're getting a lot of anecdotal sort of advice on the updosing and whatnot based on their experience there that's not published. Again, we don't know the degree to what sustained unresponsiveness will be achieved, but the primary outcome is tolerating 2 grams of each, of at least 2 allergens at week 36. So it's 2 grams. Remember, the other was 300 milligrams, and it's in phase 3. And in the patch studies, we're not seeing patients tolerating gram quantities very often. At the end, we're seeing more 300, 500 milligram. So this is basically a very, like a Rambo, goal. There's the screening challenges, which are very tedious when you're talking about up to 5 foods plus a placebo day. That's 6 all-day visits. Week 0 to 16, all they get is omalizumab, no placebo arm. Use the same table as the asthma, so we're not using Hive's table for this. Week 8, so while omalizumab is still ongoing, we begin with a rush desensitization. And yesterday, I was there, we started a guy like at 3 in the afternoon. He made it to 1,250 milligrams without symptoms. He reacted at 5 milligrams to peanut and 50 milligrams to milk 2.5 months ago. And yesterday he tolerated over a gram of the combination of the two. So it's a pretty dramatic bridge that this provides, at least in some patients, and he's one of them. And so now, to get to 2 grams, it's not nearly as hard, 2 grams of each food. So he's 2 foods, so he has to get up to just 4 grams. If he had 5 foods, he has to get up to 10 grams of the mix. And it's every 2-week updosing until 2 grams are achieved, and it's a maintenance. And then at week 30, we do the oral challenges again. All patients get this, so there's no placebo yet. And at week 30, they get randomized to either continue the 2 grams of each, or reduce to 300 milligrams of each, or placebo for 6 weeks, and then at week 36, repeat the challenge. So they're trying to get at least some better data about tolerance, or at least 6 weeks of how much do you lose on average, and there's enough patients that they should be able to see some outliers and what the ranges are.
They stay on omalizumab?
No, the omalizumab's only for 8 weeks, so it sort of quietly falls off the map as they're building up, and we haven't seen reactive issues with it. So they either tolerate or the maintenance or not, but it doesn't seem correlated with the timing of withdrawal of omalizumab. As you know, it's going to work for a month or 2 anyway at some level. So But yeah, so she had reassured me that that was the case, and anecdotally in this study so far, that's, you know, we've had, let's see, we have 12 patients, and more than half of them have gotten that far, so it's been fine. So no, these patients come in with these Tupperwares filled with food, and that's their, and they leave with a big bag with a Tupperware for each day of their life to eat, and this is all stuff they've been told that, you know, they could never eat ever. So it's pretty impressive. So, but we'll see. All right, so other things, and I'll do this really quickly because we're out of time pretty much. These are non-food applications of immunotherapy that are exciting and also relevant in Seattle. Like the catnip, the ITN study that is being done, a multi-center study, we're one of the arms. And our coordinator, Ryan, is in the audience here, where it's anti-TSLP plus subcutaneous immunotherapy for cat using an allergen challenge model, a nasal allergen challenge. And we also provide blood to Bill Fox Lab for this. So we'll see, you know, whether they're interested in transitioning to food with this. Also, there's peptide immunotherapy models, as you all know. This company, Circassia, in England, that's doing it. And we're involved at Dust Mite 1. There's some cat data already in the literature. But they're in phase 3 of both cat and dust mite. In fact, the cat's pretty much done. They expect that to be on the market in the next year, is my understanding. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about patient care in the last couple of minutes. We are all still doing, as we always have, low-risk oral food challenges in our offices. I think, you know, all practicing allergists do that for foods and drugs and other things. One of the things that we've done with the Food Allergy Consortium is basically a high-risk oral food challenge opportunity, which is at Children's Hospital, and you can see the docs in town that aren't all in the same group. Drew, Ayers, Dave Namey, Frank Grant, Dave Young, and Lisa Winteroth are all attending in this every 2-week clinic at Children's for high-risk oral food challenges. And we're still kind of ironing out the kinks whether this is people we know are going to react, and we need to see before they go off to college how bad it's going to be and what level it is, which I think is a valid question, versus are you allergic or not? And those are, you know, but that's an evolving discussion. And then there's the research double-blind food-controlled, placebo-controlled food challenges at the CRC, which is about 100 feet away, but behind a different door, with many of the same docs that they don't volunteer, but kind of they're giving up time in their life to do it, and they get a small stipend to help with it. So that's patient care that's going on research-wise. Well, as I mentioned, we had this pro-con debate a while back. Many of you know Jim Baker, and for all I know, he's on the phone right now, and is an old friend from Oregon when I worked there. And he's been doing oral immunotherapy out of his office with success for I think at least 10 years. And so we have some sort of comfort there. In Seattle now, as you can imagine, as patients are rotating off these studies, do they want to stop their oral immunotherapy when, you know, they went through all this and they're eating 2 grams of 5 foods every day as their treatment? No. So we've got to figure out, and the protocol is done, so we don't have an IRB approved, you know, what do we do now option. So, you know, Mary Farrington and I have talked a lot about what to do with these people. And, you know, these MTAC subjects who are rotating off are really highly motivated. And as I mentioned, there was this Center of Excellence thing that our clinic has gotten in. So our vision is, and I think our partners are on board with it, is to create a system for approaching this, to get patients, for example, randomized placebo that lost some of their ability to tolerate the food if they so desire, to get back up to 2 grams, that we could do low-risk updosing, usually probably a 25% increase in every 2 weeks rather than the more bold ones out of our clinic, and bill for it, have it be part of our clinical care for that patient. And so that's a work in process. And then, but there's still some other things. What about the patients that finish the patch study and, you know, they tolerate 300 but they want to go more? Is this a reasonable bridge to an oral immunotherapy protocol or a clinic-based oral immunotherapy? We don't know. What about the relevance of the skin test results? As I mentioned, some of the patients' skin test negative. At Stanford, they're doing routine skin testing, and because of the bulk of all these foods, that there's 5 they're allergic to, it's a lot to choke down every day. And so if the patient skin tests negative to 2 or 3 of them after being on the oral immunotherapy for a year or so, they reduce that food to 300 milligrams. Supposing or hypothesizing that it doesn't take as much to retain that desensitization in it to force it in. We don't know the answer, but they're gathering data, and there's this ongoing dialogue with them about how to do it. So how do we transition from 2 grams of study drug to equivalent doses of food from the market rather than the pharmaceutical grade food flour? And we now have these conversions of X mils of whole milk equals 2 grams of milk flour, or and Stanford has actually done this. It's actually gone to markets, and they have published created documents that have individual product names and what they correlate with, and it's surprising some of the conversions. So in summary, before 2010, really not a lot going on in Seattle. 2016, a lot going on in Seattle. Phase 2, Phase 3, 1 high-dose oral immunotherapy with omalizumab, BRI doing great work at the bench, collaboration on twin studies, high-risk oral food challenge clinic, and we're now sort of going to the next level with the clinic care too. So it's been great. It's hard to have a real job on the side doing all this stuff, and hopefully we'll be paving new ground in the future for everybody. So sorry I didn't read that. Any quick questions?
Steve, thank you. That was just what I asked you to do, a total review of an exploding area.
Yeah, it's been a roller coaster for sure.
And for those of you who are young in this field, I don't think asthma and rhinitis is your future anymore. I think this is
Yeah, it may not. The order of immunotherapy. How's it going? Good. Good to see you.
Nice to see you too.
This is kind of out of your comfort zone, right?
Well, yeah, I was wondering. I mean, it seemed to me, I read up about this quite a bit because I was on one of the review panels for something like 5 or 6 years ago about, it seemed like really Tregs, like T-Rex response was really that.
Yeah, well, that's what the clock in Spain.
Right.
For the,
I mean, that's what it looked like, isn't that figure, right? The TH1, TR1 with suppression of those effectors, right?
Yeah, and I don't know if you've seen his data that ever. He has this tetramer technique.
Right. No, I'm very well. I mean, we put in his together. So
yeah, I ripped into that woman. Did you hear me say that? Don't blame.
They had a project. I had a project on.
My apologies to you.
Yeah, it was very disruptive. You know, the guy's trying to. Yeah. I know that. What's the lady's name from Shire? Yeah, when they tried to trick with her, she hasn't paid it.
From my as a clinician, just seeing
the next time you have to pay
convergence
telling
of
you
because you're doing shots for 100 years, right?
right. You should pay some price
for around stuff over the
accomplishment.
Right. Well, I mean, it honestly, it all started yesterday. Even when I called, they were too busy to take my order. Too busy to take my order. So that started off on the wrong foot right there, and it just went downhill. So I have several other ones coming up, but I can guarantee you I will not be using
have some sort of phenotype.
Okay.
Now we know that was.
Good. You might, this is not the first time.
And now they could like find out
a couple exactly what
I know it happened to Julie.
Yeah,
She
we
didn't even
actually,
show up.
whenever we set up in
So, I mean, Christine
in
coordinated.
one of our mouse studies, we set up
Here today.
Yeah, I'll let her know what happened.
Yeah, so you might collectively decide to go somewhere else.
Yeah. What do we do with it? Do I bring them to your office or collect it?
for over.
Anyways, now,
But yeah, the problem is like you have to pick out.
Okay, next week. Yeah, I'm not very happy with the narrow. It's not the first time. Yeah.
That's the problem. Like I have
not happy, and the young woman probably got scared.
She was a little shaky.
Yeah.
She was a little shaky.
All good, that's what she deserved.
all these fellows and PhD, and it's like, so we're our goal is like provide fresh blood. Apparently, the assays are better with blood cell taps. Right. So that's why we're just for that ITN cap study.